This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey everybody, this is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning Podcast, and today I am here with Dan McCarthy, someone who I have known of on the internet for, I'm just going to say it, 25 years now. I think I started reading you, Dan, back at the Lou Rockwell site, back in my, anarcho-libertarian days. I don't know if I think that was, I was still would go by that term back then. It was a long time ago. Right now, you are the editor of Modern Age, and you're a VP at ISI and a columnist at the Spectator. You were also, for a while, the editor of the American Conservative. So I think that gives you people a general sense of where you're from. First of all, we are recording. I'm recording actually a fair number of podcasts right now with more like political, social, cultural thinkers than usual, because we are recording in the wake of the 2024 victory of Donald J. Trump over Kamala Harris and the return of Trump to the White House, obviously. And I think a lot of people thought 2016 was a bit of a speed bump. I guess we can, say that it's not a speed bump. It's a new era a bit, and people are talking about realignment. We've already discussed racial depolarization. Earlier trends have been exacerbated of the shift to the white working class, to the Republicans, of the defection of educated Americans, let's say professional managerial class, to the Democrats. But also there was a overall trend in almost every demographic, except for, I think, white college-educated men, towards Trump. So there's an overall realignment that we are seeing, but within that, there was also just a consistent overall shift of the electorate. Trump right now is the popular vote winner in addition to the electoral vote winner. So there's a lot going on there. I know that you have written, I'll say, in favor of Trump, I think, earlier. I think you were in the New York Times, actually, with some of your pieces. And so, I'm curious about what your take on this moment in our modern age is.
Well, I agree, obviously, that 2016 was not a fluke. We've now had, a confirmation that people want the kind of disruption that Donald Trump represents. It's interesting. The New York Times, they did a survey of undecided young voters, and then they asked them after the election how they wound up voting. And even though I say that, and I wrote this in a New York Times op-ed piece, and I've said it in other contexts as well, even though I tend to emphasize the disruptive element of Donald Trump, the fact that he represents a very big change in our foreign policy, a big change, at least, in terms of the direction he wants to take our foreign policy. We can get into the nitty-gritty of exactly what's been implemented further in the conversation. Similarly, on economics, on trade, on immigration, Trump is a big change from the way Washington was doing business a decade ago, at least, again, in terms of the direction the sort of elite in both parties wanted to move. Interestingly enough, though, like I say, the young people, undecided voters that the New York Times talked to and then wrote a piece about after the election, they were often looking to Trump to bring back a certain degree of normality. They didn't like political correctness. They didn't like inflation. They had just normal, sort of voter concerns. So I think Trump actually, in 2024, he represented a rejection of the actual record of political correctness and inflation and wokeism in the Biden years, while also, I think, still fundamentally representing this idea that the, direction that Washington as a whole, both Republicans and Democrats wanted to head in, from 2000 up until 2016, involving, relatively, high levels of immigration, foreign engagements all over the world. In fact, there's hardly a war that America wasn't trying to get involved in back in those years. And also, a trade policy which says that free trade is always good and that there's nothing to worry about with the decline of sort of Rust Belt cities or the American industrial workforce. I think that whole ideology that came about in the late 1990s has been repudiated. But it's not just that voters repudiated that; they also just didn't like the abnormality of the Biden years, both economically with inflation and socially with wokeism.
Yeah, definitely. It's that was actually the pitch. I think for 2020, going back to normal in the wake of what was basically a celebrity president. Donald Trump is known to the public as a celebrity. He was on TV. He was a public figure, and there was I would say there was like a daily food fight in the press of like just crazy things back and forth. I think it exhausted whether you were pro-Trump or anti-Trump, whatever side you were on. I think it exhausted most people. I'm not gonna lie. I think there is a faction on both sides that actually secretly enjoyed it and kind of fed off it. So I think it was a little overdone. Biden, how do I say this? He's very geriatric. I will say I have a friend who's a Democrat who told friends that he was not going to vote for Biden because he saw clear signs of dementia. This friend has seen this in his family. So in a way, you would think, oh, well, that would be a boring presidency. But the reality is when you don't have a strong hand at the till, weird things happen. And so I think that's some of what you saw, right? You saw a lack of strength, and the Democratic ruling class, I guess, isn't coherent enough to have a vision that imposes order. And then obviously another issue that I want to bring up is, we're seeing the shift of the professional managerial class to the Democrats and to the left. And in a way, they are being siloed to the point where I think they eat their own dog food, so to speak. Like they believe their own propaganda. Whatever they say is the new truth. And I think one of the I'm just going to propose this idea that on the left, these wordsmiths, verbal professionals, they think creating the word and the definition and the assertion is all that's needed. So, for example, inflation. Well, it's just transitory price increase. So they really did try that for a while. They thought if they just said it, defined it, and asserted it, that people would accept it, and they didn't.
Yeah, so I mean, Biden, in a weird way, I think, was maybe even a slightly better president than your judgment there perhaps indicates. Not that I think he was a good president, but despite his decrepitude, despite his inability to complete a sentence and to represent himself and his ideas on a debate stage with Donald Trump, it seems to me that the difficulties that Biden found himself in were really not necessarily personal human difficulties arising from his age. They were difficulties arising from the general Democratic Party way of doing things, which is a way of saying, there's this iron law of oligarchy. You may have a president, you may have, a unitary executive in one man in the federal government. And yet the truth is, whether it's a competent person or an incompetent, senile one like Joe Biden, it's the advisors, it's the department heads, and a much larger cast of characters who are actually running the government, and their hands are the ones at the tiller. So what I think we got, and it surprised me. One thing I was really worried about with this election, I had no idea whether voters would accept the idea that Kamala Harris was a continuation of Joe Biden, or whether they would see this candidate who was suddenly substituted for Biden as a completely new force in American politics, and whether they would exempt her or absolve her of the Biden record, and whether they would actually look at Trump and say, you know what, Trump is the one who reminds me of, not just, all the antics of his first term, but also, the fact that Trump has been a major public figure throughout the Biden years as well. So voters might have decided that Trump represented all the things that have aggravated them over the last several years, and that Kamala Harris was a fresh face. Much to my relief, it turned out that voters actually were smarter than that, and they said, wait a minute, Kamala Harris has been, Joe Biden's vice president. She actually bears, a very large measure, if not full responsibility for the terrible things that have happened in Biden's term. So it's, I think, a repudiation not just of Biden, not just of Kamala Harris as a uncharismatic candidate, but of the Democratic Party's way of doing politics. And part of it is what you said, that Democrats would, someone would be, to use a vulgar but appropriate metaphor here, someone's peeing on your shoes and tells you it's raining, right? I mean, people don't take kindly to that kind of what's now called gaslighting. We saw a lot of that with the Democrats. We saw it with inflation. We saw it with redefining what a woman is. We saw it with just across the board. With wokeism and evasions that Democrats, we saw it even, of course, with Biden's own status. Right up until they chased him out of running for re-election, Democrats and their sort of propaganda mouthpieces in the mainstream media were all saying Joe Biden is a great president. He's a very successful president. He's turned the economy around. Inflation's coming down. So that whole, you're exactly right. There was an unreality, a virtual reality that progressives were able to create for themselves. And it was reinforced by all of these respectable institutions, by the prestige media, by the Atlantic magazine, by the Washington Post, by the universities. And in fact, this separation from reality and from the life that Americans were actually leading has gone to such an extreme that it's even led them now, after the coming down to earth of Kamala Harris's defeat, it's led them all to split off from Twitter and form their own new social media, which was already, sort of up and running, but has now grown by leaps and bounds since Harris's defeat. Blue Sky, I just last night actually explored Blue Sky for the first time. And wow, it's like walking into a parallel universe where, there's been no course correction whatsoever after what happened on November 5th.
Yeah, I'm on Blue Sky. Mostly because a lot of scientists left Twitter, and honestly, Blue Sky is so far an okay way to find scientific stuff. There is some just random political stuff that I obviously don't care for, but that's neither here nor there. I will say it reminds me of the Saturday Night Live sketch called The Bubble, which was a bubble created after 2016 where you could just pretend that Hillary won. There was like alternative media. You didn't have to be reminded of Trump. And also, it was in Brooklyn. Also, it ended with, but there's no cops in the bubble because they couldn't find anyone who voted for Hillary. Anyway, so it reminds me a little bit of the bubble, and we'll see how long it can go. Colin Wright, who has been on this podcast, he's a friend of mine, and he's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute now, but he does come out of academia. He used to be a WASP social ecologist, but he did assert that there were two sexes on Blue Sky, and he was flagged for intolerance. Yeah, so that's what's going on there. But I do think that overall the cultural mood has shifted. So your publication is called Modern Age. It was founded by Russell Kirk. Some listeners will know what that means. Kind of a very like traditionalist conservative figure, not a neoconservative, not a libertarian conservative, but traditionalist conservative. I think some people have asserted that he was the ancestor of the paleo conservatives and the old right. I don't know what you think about that, because I think that contention was kind of made by people not of the movement of the old right. So it's a little bit of outsider perspective. So you're seeing a lot of changes. You seem to be hopeful of changes. Do you think that that's a little bit, ironic in light of the disposition of your journal, your own disposition as a conservative?
Yeah, so in the mid-1950s, there was kind of a race between William F. Buckley Jr., who had published God and Man at Yale around 1951, Buckley on the one hand, and Russell Kirk, who had published The Conservative Mind in 1953, on the other. And each one of them wanted to start a magazine to kind of define the new post-war conservatism that was emerging in the 50s. And Buckley turned out to be the better fundraiser, so he launches National Review in 1955. It takes Kirk a bit more time to start Modern Age. Modern Age gets started in 1957. And Modern Age, even then didn't have the money to be a fortnightly or a weekly like National Review aspired to be, and instead had to settle for being a quarterly. And also because Kirk's own interests were more scholarly and more literary. Modern Age has always been a more philosophical and literary journal rather than being one that's focused on news events. Although we have recently launched a website for Modern Age earlier this year, modernagejournal.com, which does feature daily content, a lot of it drawn from our archives, some of it from the print magazine, some of it newly commissioned for the web. It still tries to take a long view of things, but it's a little bit more timely as the web requires. So people would think that Russell Kirk, maybe he's an old stick in the mud, maybe he's just this old-fashioned guy who would have, very timid views about politics, didn't like to rock the boat. It's not really true. Kirk was actually quite politically engaged during his lifetime. So he dies in the 1990s. He's born in the 1910s, and Kirk. He supported Barry Goldwater. He, gave a speech or two on Goldwater's behalf, even though Goldwater is more of a libertarian conservative and Kirk was much more of a traditionalist. Kirk actually liked Republican politics. He also met with Richard Nixon. He told Richard Nixon to put mines in the Haiphong Harbor in Vietnam. So Kirk was, quite willing to get involved in the nitty-gritty of some of this stuff. And then towards the end of his life, in the early 1990s, Kirk becomes an active supporter of Pat Buchanan and a very big critic of the neoconservatives and a very big critic of George H.W. Bush. And in fact, there is a famous letter. You mentioned Lew Rockwell earlier in the podcast here. There's a famous letter that Kirk wrote to Lew Rockwell when the two of them were both supporting Pat Buchanan in 1991, 1992, where Kirk says that he thinks George H.W. Bush should be hanged from the lawn of the White House or on the lawn of the White House because of Gulf War I. That's how intensely Russell Kirk disliked neoconservative, warmongering and internationalism. So I actually see a lot of what's happening with Trump, not his personality perhaps, but the change that he represents in politics as being very much in keeping with what Russell Kirk and Pat Buchanan and others wanted to see happen in American politics after the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, I think those who don't know much about the conservative movement or Republican politics, the sea change here of your position of, let's say, Buchananism. And so Buchananism, let's define that as after the Cold War, Buchanan's position was defined by, relative. I mean, it's considered a pejorative isolationism, but let's say a more modest foreign policy, retrenchment from the world, more nationalist trade policies, or nationalist immigration policies, a restrictionist immigration policy. And this was in contrast with where the Republican Party was for the 90s, 2000s, and up to Donald Trump. And, during the Gulf War, the second Gulf War, was it Operation Desert Storm, right? That was the one in the early 2003. Okay. And that was the one 20 years ago.
It's Operation Iraqi Freedom. And the rumor is that the original code name for it was going to be Operation Iraqi Liberation until they realized what the acronym spelled.
Operation Iraqi Operation
OIL.
Oh, which is what people. Okay, what people. But this was a period when someone like you, and the people who came together created the American Conservative, Pat Buchanan, Scott McConnell, Taki, a few others. To be anti-war and to be on the right was like you were taking crazy pills, right?
Oh yeah, totally.
And so you have seen in your adult life, as a professional, you have your PhD, but you've been in this like world of writing, these think magazines. You have seen, you have literally gone from the wilderness. Now you're at your ideas are at the center of things, arguably, right? And so I think it's very interesting, and maybe it should serve as a lesson to people who go from view to view to try to be with the next hot thing, because the next hot thing will someday also be in the past. And I think people will notice when you have no core, no sense of, real principles, right? So the people at the American Conservative, Now they're just, actually, arguably, I'm just going to bring this up because people have brought it up. Arguably, it's caused issues for the magazine, The American Conservative, in terms of what its brand is. Because it had a very specific brand when you were running it and earlier that made it distinctive from other conservative publications. And now you have places like National Review. Michael Brendan Doherty, who comes out of the American Conservative, is an editor at National Review. And there is space now at National Review for that type of, maybe Michael's a little milder than some people would be, but, more isolationist, more anti-interventionist conservatism that isn't as hawkish and pro-neocon. And so, how do you brand differentiate, right? And a lot of the neocons are now Democrats.
Yeah, no, it's
which is actually what some of the anti-interventionist conservatives always said about
exactly. You have no idea, just how much joy and Schadenfreude I take from the vindication that so many of us have received. Because 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we were all saying Bill Kristol's not a conservative. This guy, he really hates grassroots conservatives. He just wants to get the country into a lot of wars, and that's what he cares about. He doesn't care about social issues or abortion or anything else. And at the time, those of us who were saying this, we had our reasons for saying it. We understood how, the priorities that people like Bill Kristol or David Frum, the priorities they had, we understood how they fit together and what conclusions we could draw from that. But most people don't have that kind of sophisticated feel for ideologies. They just see individual positions and they think, well, whatever a person says about, where he stands on a given issue must be ultimately where he stands, that there can't be this larger logic informing his entire worldview. So at the time, a lot of naive conservatives said, oh, Bill Kristol's okay. He's against abortion. He's basically a conservative across the board. He just wants a slightly more active foreign policy than you guys do. Now, of course, it's great because Bill Kristol, he's even gone woke. He's even talking about, police are racist and all kinds of things, which, it used to be one of the few good things that neocons were actually strong on was urban policing. People like Rudy Giuliani, for example, in New York City. And now even that has been thrown by the wayside. Even wokeism has been embraced by people like Kristol, to a lesser extent Frum as well, in the name of, anti-Trumpism and especially, rejecting Trump's, what he represents in foreign policy. So that's a huge vindication. Now, you're right that it's harder in some ways to be to take the responsibilities of victory than it is to be simply a critic with few responsibilities who's always, sort of lobbing bombs or arrows from the sidelines. When I first, became a young conservative, a young, especially paleo-conservative, I was getting the message from people like Pat Buchanan, who was a syndicated columnist and who was on TV. I really got it in a big way from Chronicles magazine, which in the 1990s was, really by far the strongest and clearest, paleo-conservative voice that was out there. And then in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were a number of these websites and actually a group of anarcho-capitalists or people who are sometimes called paleo-libertarians, people who, were around Murray Rothbard, the great Austrian economist. He's American, but he's, an expert in Austrian economics. Murray Rothbard, Ron Paul, Lou Rockwell, all those people, the Mises Institute, and antiwar.com, which was led by a very interesting character named Justin Raimondo, who was an old-time, paleo-libertarian associate of Murray Rothbard, but who also became a very big fan of Pat Buchanan and actually gave a endorsement speech for Buchanan at the 2000 Reform Party convention. Anyway, all these people were completely marginalized, as you say. They were seen as being just cantankerous lunatics who were not clubbable. They could not be invited to the American Enterprise Institute or even the Heritage Foundation. They were people who, after 1997, were definitely not welcome in the pages of National Review. And it turned out that this, sort of almost Halloween-like coalition of eccentric individuals with, some pretty, outside the mainstream views, they were actually, 20 or 25 years ahead of the curve. And so much of what we see now with Trump is actually, parallel to the things that were being said in Chronicles magazine or at antiwar.com and other places, 2 decades or more ago. I think there is a market differentiation. Chronicles is still around. Chronicles is edited by Paul Gottfried, who's one of the great legends of paleoconservatism, someone who was in the trenches with Buchanan and Murray Rothbard and the others back in the 1990s. So Chronicles is still sort of the paleoconservative magazine. When the American Conservative started in the early 2000s, about a year before the Iraq War was launched, its purpose was to take the paleoconservative view and put it into a more elite discourse in Washington, D.C. and within realist foreign policy circles. So these realists, people like John Mearsheimer and others, they weren't necessarily ideological supporters of Pat Buchanan and of paleoconservatism, but they were critics of neocons. They were critics of the Iraq War. And so the American Conservative magazine was trying to bring those elements together with the paleoconservative base that had supported Pat Buchanan during his presidential runs. And that was always a little bit of an awkward mixture. But it was one of the things that made, I think, the American Conservative a bit different from a magazine like Chronicles, which was, Chronicles was very proud of not being in Washington, D.C. They were based in Rockford, Illinois. Now they're based in Frankfort, Kentucky. They were definitely, self-consciously outside the Beltway. The American Conservative, on the other hand, was self-consciously inside the Beltway and was fighting the battles there. Now it's difficult because as you've mentioned, there are all these other conservative publications and authors who have a very, American conservative-like view, whether that's Michael Brennan Doherty at National Review, whether it's some of the folks at the Claremont Institute, and at the American Mind, their online publication, and other publications they're involved with. So, but I think the American Conservative could still differentiate itself quite substantially in returning to that original vision that it had. Its current editor, Kurt Mills, I think has a lot of that, although he's quite young, so he doesn't have quite the same degree of experience. But that original vision of what happens when you take paleoconservatism and you put it into conversation with the more elite discourse that was actually represented by someone like Scott McConnell, who's one of the founders of the magazine. Scott McConnell is a WASP. He is someone who has a Columbia education, which Murray Rothbard did as well, actually. But Scott McConnell represented a kind of, WASP elite demographic that was very different from what the paleocons tended to emphasize. And there's still very interesting questions to be brought out. Now, even though the Claremont Institute and others are doing things that are somewhat similar to what the American Conservative does in foreign policy and immigration and other things, they also have, a traditional commitment to the views of Harry Jaffa and other things that are quite distinct from the more paleo views that are associated with the American Conservative. So there are distinctions, but they are becoming more subtle, perhaps, in this era of paleo triumphalism, perhaps.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of, as they said, there's a lot to unpack there. I will say, I am curious. So the Claremont Institute has become very prominent, with the broader public, maybe in conservative media to some extent. Just context, I mean, you can give more detail or color to this, but Claremont is West Coast, it's associated with some of an aspect of Leo Strauss's thought, the great political philosopher who also was a mentor or a source for some American neoconservatives. And I think Harry Jaffa's big thing is a big pro-Lincoln guy, which would immediately put him at odds with a lot of the old right paleo people who were very, some of them were neo-Confederates, but a lot of them were just very suspicious of the statism that was ushered in by the Union's victory in the Civil War. But they got on the Trump train, to cut it short, after 2016, more and more aggressively. Whereas, say, National Review, another venerable old magazine, is more anti-Trump, I would say. So it's been National Review has been kind of charting a course, kind of in between, not being wholehearted, supporter of Donald J. Trump while supporting of many of his policies, I would say, and definitely not Democrat. Let's just say they didn't go full. The Weekly Standard is now the bulwark online, and it is a pro-democratic organ, right? So they have not totally converted, but Claremont is kind of the house. Claremont Review of Books, very intellectual in origin. A lot of this content, and yet there is also now a MAGA wing or a MAGA aspect to it. And I think that's an interesting mix because, like, let me ask you, because you're the intellectual historian of this sort of stuff. Would Harry Jaffa be pro-Trump? I don't know. I don't know. It seems like in the origins of the Claremont, Institute is a little bit more high toned than that. So that's my perception.
Well, I think Harry Jaffa might very well be pro-Trump. And, Jaffa famously helped to contribute and really is responsible for Barry Goldwater's famous line that, extremism in defense of liberty is, not a bad thing. So Harry Jaffa, one of his important philosophical points of emphasis is the importance of equality in American life, that equality is in fact the foundational principle of America. This is one of the dividing lines between Jaffa and the paleoconservatives, because the paleoconservatives, as with a great many conservatives, they philosophically do not like the concept of equality. And they can make, allowances for equality of opportunity, citizenship equality, but they really don't like equality as a philosophical concept. And Harry Jaffa emphasized that equality is the heart of the Declaration of Independence, and the Declaration of Independence, in Jaffa's view, is not just a statement that America is breaking away from the British Empire, but is really the philosophical foundation of American life to this day. So there was this deep philosophical divide, as well as this historical clash over the interpretation of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. All of these very high, differences between the Paleos and the Claremont Institute, however, didn't necessarily turn into concrete differences in policy. And the Trump era has kind of revealed that. There were differences, perhaps, in the 1980s or 1990s, but in the 21st century, in the 2020s, first of all, Jaffa's emphasis on equality means that he always was very opposed to affirmative action and anything that basically took race into consideration in lawmaking. So on those grounds alone, he would, I think, be very strongly supportive of Trump and very, very critical of the woke Democratic Party, which, of course, not only, continues to be in favor of affirmative action, but has vastly expanded the amount of the role that, race and identity politics plays in the democratic view of American law. So I think Jaffa would be very comfortable with Trump in that regard on the issue. And I think also Jaffa, he was himself a kind of extreme personality, not in the same way that Trump is. But Jaffa had this tendency to feud with almost everything, including with almost everyone, including some of his, friends and allies, not just paleoconservatives, but even, East Coast Straussians. Someone like Harvey Mansfield, for example, had a famous, contretemps with Harry Jaffa. So Jaffa, I think he would, be quite prepared to accept the rough and tumble, coalition building of the Trump era, and would actually be, quite enthusiastic. However, I will say there is a kind of civil war among admirers of Harry Jaffa, where a number of more timid scholars, perhaps, are very critical of the Claremont Institute. They think the Claremont Institute has sold out by getting into bed with Trump and with nationalism and so forth. And so there is that tension. But the Claremont Institute, I think, has been kind of had the most clear-sighted entrepreneurial vision. Even at the earliest stage of the Trump movement back in 2015 and 2016, they recognized how the ideas they already cared about could actually be magnified by Trump, and that they could actually fit together in a way that would be helpful. And I think too few other conservative institutions had that kind of boldness. And in fact, I was editor of the American Conservative at the time, and I kept thinking, they are kind of a lap ahead of us in this race, and we should actually be doing a lot more to figure out, how, it's already obvious in some ways that Trump represents, views that we've cared about for a long time, but we should really be completely, unabashed about that. Not just in terms of, supporting Trump, but rather, really holding up the idea that, our themes are coming to the fore here, and we don't have to worry that, Trump is inconsistent, or, that Trump, may not go far enough or may go too far on things. It's really the main center of gravity, and the fact that was moving in our direction. That's what we should have emphasized.
Well, in some ways, Trump obviously has certain principles. Always been fascinated by tariffs, immigration restrictionist. There's a few things like this. He seems to he is an American nationalist, whatever that means, Jacksonian impulses. But in terms of ideologically, he is all over the place, and he can be convinced, I guess. You come out of a world steeped in ideology, in terms of the conservative movement of the second half of the 20th century, with Straussians and libertarians and neocons, old school moderate Republicans, Rockefeller Republicans like George H.W. Bush, is all that by the wayside? Is all that history just water under the bridge now? Because, so you've alluded to a few things that a lot of people won't know, like, Mel Bradford, for example, at NEA in the 1980s. There was certain people lost, their career pathway because they took, certain stances, right? Being an anti-war Republican in the 2000s was difficult. So all of this happened, and now Trump is bringing everyone back together, well, with the exception of the hardcore neocons, as we were saying. How does that feel? Do you think that this, this is going to be his last term?
Maybe.
JD Vance, we'll see. JD Vance, for example, seems like a much more, I want to say conventionally ideological, but he articulates his ideology in a much more conventional way. So maybe we will return back to a little bit more factionalism. I don't know. He certainly does not, and I love JD, obviously, but he certainly does not have the leadership of this broad base that Trump does, right? So are we going to be back to factionalism? Is ideology going to be salient again, or was that just something in the past at this point? Are we in a new world in American politics?
Oh, I think we are. So, there was a problem during the 1990s and 2000s, basically the post-Cold War era, where conservative ideas and conservative philosophy and what's, called conservative principles, they all became just a series, like a checklist and a series of talking points and a series of banalities. Free markets, family values, strong national defense, all of which, even a normal Democrat is not actually against those things, right? But they have a very different interpretation of what they mean. So when people talk about a loss of conservative principles because of Trump, they really don't know what they're talking about. Because in fact, even though you had these platitudes about conservative principles, America was making a lot of very bad, decisions that smarter conservatives like Russell Kirk or Pat Buchanan recognized in the 1990s when they were being made that these decisions were going to be disastrous in terms of, strengthening Chinese industry and weakening America, in terms of getting involved in Middle East conflicts. These were not things that really conservative principles said that you should be doing, but they were things that a, sort of hackneyed establishment, George H.W. Bush version of conservatism wound up investing in. And then most of the conservative movement said, well, if George H.W. and then subsequently George W., if the Bushes are, the Republican leaders, then the conservative movement should get behind and promote these ideas. And it wasn't just selling out to political power. There were, neoconservatives and others who were, intellectually supporting this kind of globalist, basically, agenda back in the 1990s and 2000s. So the principles, were oftentimes just slogans. And a lot of conservatives who just don't, and I'll be very blunt here, don't have the brain power to think beyond slogans are now baffled that, oh, you mean just cutting taxes all the time isn't good enough? That, that free trade, in fact, is not, always a good thing. They feel as if principles have been abandoned, when in fact what's actually been abandoned are slogans and kind of stale habits of mind, not the underlying principles that, you should put your country, first, at least in most political lights, second only to universal truth, to, the truths of religion and philosophy. And even then, those truths have to be, localized, which is going to put them in a national context and also the context of federalism, states and localities. So conservatism, real conservatism, even though there are different varieties of it represented by a Russell Kirk or by, a Pat Buchanan, a Wilmore Kendall, Richard Weaver, Leo Strauss, we can talk about all these different varieties. Even though there are a lot of different varieties, all of them are a lot richer and a lot more open to creative applications of their ideas. Not because they're less principled than slogan-based conservatism, but rather the opposite, because, all of these real philosophies understand that there is a difficulty always posed by how you operationalize and put into practice these great ideas about, the meaning of human life and the direction of civilization. Now, I think J.D. Vance is, well, first of all, Trump, as you say, he has an instinctual understanding that America made a lot of wrong moves in the post-Cold War era, and he's trying to move in the opposite direction now on trade, immigration, foreign policy, perhaps a few other things as well. So Trump actually is instinctively quite a wise individual, even if he's not, someone who's reading massive tomes on conservative philosophy. J.D. Vance, on the other hand, is someone who does read those massive tomes of conservative philosophy and does keep up with conversations among conservative intellectuals. But I think Vance is actually very much in continuity with Trump in that, he may articulate these ideas in a, sort of more intellectual and systematic way, but his instincts are rooted in the same place. And at first, there was some difference between Vance and Trump in that Vance thought that Trump's, personality was detrimental to the ideas that he was championing. But now Vance has come around to the, in fact, you can't argue with success. And Trump, his personality and, any black marks against him have been disregarded by the public. And in fact, not just disregarded, but the public trusts Trump in a way they don't trust anyone else. So Vance, I think it's a good experience for him to be Trump's vice president. He's going to come out of this even stronger. He's not going to lose his intellectual edge, which will still be there. He's also not going to lose his softer side, which I think came through very effectively in the vice presidential debate with Tim Walz. But he's going to have that amplified by this, by the experience of working with someone as pragmatic and yet whose instincts are as true as Trump's have been.
Well, I want to actually ask you a question about the Republican Party and conservatism, and just like we are of a certain age now, we can have observed certain changes. So I was, as because you commented at the time, I have our mutual friend Heather McDonald, a person of very strong, trenchant opinions, and there was a period, let's say like during the George W. Bush administration, where the brand of American republicanism became so intensely connected to certain type of evangelical Protestantism that it was, you didn't need to be one, but it was like, okay, like you probably would have to account for it if you were a mainstream Republican in terms of people just would assume, okay? But you might be Jewish. Maybe that would help you get some brand differentiation. And so, Heather wrote a piece, that was very skeptical of religion, and she's still the same person. The issue with Heather McDonald, like if people who do not know her, is she will tell you what she thinks and she will not sugarcoat it. And that offended a lot of people because, well, you might not be religious yourself. You have to respect religion, that is a traditional conservative viewpoint. I do have to say, though, it's not just respect of religion. We're not talking George H.W. Bush type of religion. Even though George W. Bush himself, his children were raised in a pretty libertarian way, actually, from what we can tell. There was a really, really strong influence of the, quote, Christian right, traditional social conservatives. And, this was the time when people were talking about neocons and American Taliban and all of these other things. And I think it was overdone, obviously, but this was in some ways the peak of evangelical Protestantism in American culture in the post-World War II period, I think, in terms of the broader culture. And it also presaged, actually, just kind of the collapse of American Christianity to a great extent, actually, over the last generation in terms of when you look at the numbers, something like half of Zoomers are Christian, which is like, it's like, okay, we're a 50-50 country now. The 1950s, 1960s, we're a 90-10 country where, it was just like everyone was Christian or Jewish. It was a Judeo-Christian country then. Obviously, things like that have changed. Trump is culturally a Christian, nominally a Christian, but he's no George W. Bush. Things have changed a lot in the Republican Party. I actually know a lot of younger people. I mean, when you look at the demographics, it is still a predominantly white Christian party, but there's a lot more secular people in the party, people who don't go to church, even if they say they're Christian. And then obviously, people like Trump, where, I just assume he is a cultural Christian, he not very conversant in the religion. And so that has changed a lot. This is what liberals say they wanted, but it didn't really work out the way that I think they were expecting. But my question is, without the centrality of this like religious aspect, which to be fair, a lot of people still have that. And I think, in places like Oklahoma, they are trying to, have, whatever they're trying to bring back evangelical Protestant Christianity into the public square and whatnot. My own, objectively, I think it's going to fail because we're beyond that moment. And I think some of these acts and some of these decisions are a reaction to beyond that moment. We don't have that sort of religious unity or unanimity, an understanding of the same kind of currency anymore. But what is going to unify the Republic? Right now, it's unified by Donald Trump, maybe immigration, maybe nationalism. Like, what's going to bring us together?
Yeah. So, first of all, the evangelical era in the American right, which again largely coincided with George W. Bush's presidency and also the years leading up to that. I think it's easy to look at the importance of evangelical voters to the Republican base, and then also to look at George W. Bush's personal, evangelical beliefs, and to conclude from that you were dealing with a certain amount of uniformity, and that the religion was the glue that was holding that coalition together. What complicates that, however, is that the intellectual cadres of the American right, even in that era, were disproportionately Catholic, Jewish, and in many cases secular or only faintly religious. And in addition to that, evangelicalism is so fluid. And here, I don't mean to give offense to our evangelical, listeners who, I'm sure have very firm convictions of their own. But if you look at, American Christianity as a whole, including evangelicalism and other, sort of new movements, in American Christianity, they can take on very different political emphases and different political complexions over time. So I actually think that the impression of a monolithically evangelical Protestant American right during that era is it's understandable, but I think it's also misleading. And conversely, what you see now is perhaps a more honest display of the degree of diversity that there actually has been on the American right for a long time. What's different now is that it's no longer disguised, that Donald Trump, isn't out there pretending to be a model evangelical. And evangelicals themselves, and not just evangelicals, but other, very strong Christians within the American right, are they're both willing to work with people who don't agree with them on theology, and they're also at the same time, as you mentioned with Oklahoma or Louisiana, they're also becoming much more focused on actually achieving things for their own denomination in politics, whether it's putting prayer back in schools or the Ten Commandments on display. So in a weird way, you're actually seeing, I think, more religious conservatism that is politically effective right now, whether it's, evangelicalism, whether it's Christian nationalism or integralism among Catholics. But these all very, intelligently and strongly engaged forms of Christian politics are all on the upswing right now on the American right. And as you mentioned, I think you mentioned, young Americans are turning to religion in very, substantial numbers, especially on the right. So it does seem as if, some of the spread of atheism and agnosticism has kind of slowed down recently. You're still seeing a decrease in the number of Christians in America, in part because of immigration, which has largely come from countries now which are not Christian or have only Christian minorities. So it's an interesting, complicated picture. You've got a good question, though, about what will keep the American right glued together. There's still, I think, a respect for Christian civilization, a respect for the West, including its spiritual inheritance, which is partly, about Christianity and partly, about classical philosophy as well, and the heritage of Greece and Rome. So I think those elements, whether or not one is a believer, whether or not one is a Platonist or a Christian, there's still going to be a deep affection for those things and a belief that they are important things to study and to respect, even as the American right, may add elements that are, Hindu or come from, various other directions. And I think that was true, that was true even, to some degree in the past with Jewish conservatives and others. And I think it'll continue to be true now. So cultural Christianity, whether or not you see, theological Christianity as still as strong a component, I think that's not going to go away. There's also, I think the thing that traditionally glues the right together even more so is opposition to the left. And so, whether the left was socialism or more recently wokeism, that has always galvanized a very strong opposition, and conservatives have used that as the basis for creating their coalition in opposition. In terms of a deeper philosophical unity, that I think has always been rather elusive. So if you look at the conservative movement going back to the 1950s, there's a reason that we have this thing called fusionism, which tried to put together libertarianism and a more traditionalist kind of conservatism, because those things were awkward fits. And yet you already had a coalition of those elements writing for National Review and voting for Barry Goldwater. So philosophical unity is not always the basis for political unity. And that may be a healthy thing. It may actually be good that the American right has these different sort of rooms in this, mansion of many, many spaces, where you can have these, interesting philosophical and religious and theological and social discussions. And you don't all have to pretend that you are, uniformly just variations on the same person. Whereas the left actually, they've become much more conformist, much more puritanical according to their own moral code, which is a post-Christian moral code, but it's very rigorously enforced. And this wonderful meme about NPCs, non-player characters, where you're getting recited scripts from these people. You don't get any kind of original thought. That I think is now characteristic of the American center-left in a way which, that kind of unity is a bad thing. And to the extent that the American right had something like that when it was working on the basis of slogans in the George W. Bush era, that was a bad thing too, and I'm glad we're beyond it.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. That almost like religious mantras or scripts are more of a liberal or left wing thing now, and I think that part of it is, one issue that we were seeing in the last election is kind of the energy of kind of chaotic young male individualism is more on the right, whereas kind of like orderly, say female, cohesion or conformity is more on the left. And so the left is the faction of reading the room, faction of inclusion, keeping everyone not offended, and just by default, I think the right has taken the other option, which is more chaotic, and less polished. The last question that I want to ask you, I started this conversation talking about demographics and changes. The right is now more the right's electoral coalition is more working class. Okay, and this is partly a reaction to Trump's protectionism, his trade positions, but also probably a repulsion of the left's domination by professional managerial class NPCs. Let's put it that way. But the erosion among the professional managerial class isn't great, is okay for winning elections because most people are not professional managerial class. They're mostly working class, middle class, whatever, But in terms of the human capital issue with staffing agencies and doing all these sorts of things, I mean, so for example, academia in our adult lifetime has gone from being liberal to just almost no conservatives in many departments. And that's, if you look at the numbers in the 1990s, it could have been like, there's many departments that were 25% Republican. Now, they were not the majority, but 25% is a substantial number. Now you're looking at numbers that are closer to 5% if you're lucky, more likely 1% or something. And it's not good for academia. It's sustainability. It's also not good, I think, for the right that academia, that there's much less of a pipeline than there used to be.
Yeah, so in part, the organization that I'm a vice president for, ISI, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, is a remedy for that problem. So we support, conservative academics. We give them grants, we host conferences for them, we, provide them with networks to find employment. So there is actually there was a time perhaps not so long ago when that pipeline really was drying up, but it's actually been replenished recently. And so I'm quite optimistic about some of the young conservatives in grad school and other places. You're right; it's still a very hostile environment in higher education, but the people who have the perseverance as well as the talent, they do still rise to the top. I will say that I think that as far as staffing agencies and other things that would seem to be the appropriate function for the professional managerial class, I'm just not sure how valuable the work that any of these people have been doing actually is. So we'll find out with, perhaps this joint venture by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, whether we can get rid of a lot of these jobs. The other thing is that, I am increasingly skeptical of social science as a whole and the value that social science, purports to give our civilization. We've had this replication crisis, even in some of the more scientific-oriented, more harder forms of social science, like psychology, for example. Psychologists, thought that they had some really well-defined functions of the human mind and habits of thinking that they could, count on as being, foundations of their science. And, in recent years, it's been found that there's this massive replication crisis. And even things that have been taken for granted for generations turn out to be experimentally very difficult to confirm or, are falsified. So I don't worry so much about that. I think actually this chaotic energy that you spot on the right is going to lead to new kinds of innovation. And it's not a matter of having to get, enough conservatives into Harvard that you can get them out and have them staffing the Trump administration. That's not to say there's no problem with these staffing issues. But I do think it's in a weird way, it's the enemy's view of the right. It's their way of saying, well, you just don't have the Harvard grads, you don't have the Yale grads, you don't have, the technicians to do what needs to be done. And the right is actually saying, you know what, we don't need technicians and we don't want to be technical. And we actually want to be much more political, much more visceral. And certainly that's what Trump is. I mean, people would have said, you can't be Donald Trump and become elected president. You can't even get a Republican nomination. You have none of the qualifications that traditionally a candidate needs. You have none of the, the talking points. You go out there and you ad lib and you do these, Fidel Castro like, massive filibusters, on the campaign trail, and you talk about issues that might be very divisive. Donald Trump, is not the kind of candidate that would be manufactured by experts in higher education, and yet it turns out that Donald Trump was well designed to beat all of those experts. So it's not that I'm, down on higher education as a real thing. If you're actually studying hard sciences or studying history and, the classics of Western civilization, but everything else in higher education, not just the departments conservatives like to make fun of, like women's studies, but an awful lot of social science as a whole. And, unfortunately, the woke infection of the humanities as well. All of that is just useless. And, you should feel fine filling, government agencies with people who don't have college degrees. Think about how competent actually American government actually was, before the New Deal, and even during the New Deal to some extent, when it was staffed by people who didn't have these, college degrees. I mean, America wasn't built on that. America, it's always had a lawyer class. It's always had, some number of highly educated experts. But America got by just fine when it was a country that was led by people with high school degrees and not, elite college ones.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to add something there. This is a piece of social science, I think, but just like take it for how you want to take it. There is a fair amount of evidence that most college students outside of STEM and a few other fields do not actually learn anything in university. And I was a STEM major, but I did wonder what some of my friends that were like majoring in English were learning, because I don't think they're retaining any of it. They seem to be cramming these essays at the last second, and it was just 4 years of their life, and they met some people. That was cool. They did some activism. They socialized, but like I can still balance the redox equation. I mean, like with some of the STEM stuff, it's like, it is rote. You have to do the problem sets all the time, and you never really forget it. And in terms of like, if you're an engineer, I mean, if you don't know it, that the bridge collapses. So
it's a social phenomenon, right? So I mean, you've got a self-selected group. So yes, college students, may be more intelligent just in terms of natural capacity than people who are not going to college. But it's not college that's making them smarter. It's just, they've got that self-selection already taking place. And then when they get to college, it's just, it's mostly about social networking and about, credentialing. A lot of education is actually just behavior modification. It's a way of telling you, hey, you should reject, everything that you learned from your hometown or your church or whatever. And instead you should embrace these new woke values. And, a highly, philosophically minded skeptic might say, okay, maybe I don't want to just accept whatever I learned at the kitchen table, when I was growing up, but I should also probably exercise, the same degree of skepticism and maybe even more when it comes to the ideas that, the very conformist culture of America's colleges and universities are telling me are, indisputable truths that you have to, you even have to reprogram artificial intelligence systems so that they don't deviate from these truths we know, which, are absolutely not things that can be questioned. So, I think one of the great things about the Trump movement and this moment for the American right is that it's having this kind of, it's shaking things up. It's creating, creative destruction all across American life. It's done that in the media. You've seen that Joe Rogan was far more potent than MSNBC or CNN when it came to, shifting the course of the election. And, I think we're going to see something like that in academia as well. And my hope is that, universities, I see some signs of hope right now, but the universities really need to recognize the challenges that are coming and the inadequacies of the way they've been doing things for the last generation and more. And they need to, have the impetus to reform themselves. They've got massive endowments. They've got very talented people who are with them for 4 years or more. And those are great resources they could do something more productive with rather than just indoctrinating them into the mediocrity and conformism of, center-left ideology.
Yeah. Well, I think that is a good point to stop at. It was great talking to you, Dan. I will see you around next time you're coming through town in Austin. And, it was great meeting you in real life after all these years. And people can find his, writing in Spectator and obviously editor in Modern Age. And you're on the social media platforms. It's just great to talk to someone who is so well versed in the deep history of our political movements. We live in a political age. And so it's always informative and illuminating. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Razib. Greatly enjoyed it.
This podcast for kids